Was Jesus born in a barn? We've all heard these stories about how Joseph and Mary rushed into the city and the time was coming quickly where Mary needed to give birth, and so they had to try to find a place to go, and there was no room in the inn, and so they ended up in a barn with some animals. But the question is that really true? Stick around for a few minutes. You just might learn something about this story that you haven't heard before. Well, welcome back to Thus Saith the Lord. I've got a fun topic for you. We're in the Christmas season, the Christmas time frame, and so I thought this would be a fun one to tackle this week. It's about the birth of Jesus. It's about that question, where was Jesus born? Was it in a barn? Well, you might be surprised to find out that that might not be the case. And so let's look at the scripture really quick. But before we do that, take a minute to like and to subscribe and to follow. I want to get as many people following this channel as I can. We want to get really good biblical interpretation to lots of people. So share it with your friends, like it, follow it, and let's see what happens. Okay, so in Luke 2 verse 7, we're given some information about the birth of Jesus. And this is what it says. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. So this is where we get some of that key information about the story from. Okay, but there's a couple of things we need to look at in this verse. First, we need to look at what is a manger. The second thing is we need to know, what did Luke mean when he used that word inn, when he used that original Greek word. And then the third thing is, how would the culture of that day, a collectivist society, how would they treat a pregnant woman who is visiting from another town? Okay, so the first one, we know from historical accounts that a manger was a type of feeding trough for animals. Okay, it was this stone box or maybe even a wooden box, depending on the situation, where feed was kept for animals to eat out of. And so, of course, if we see manger in this verse and in this story, then we know animals must have been nearby. So we can definitely say animals were close by when Mary gave birth. But in our Western society, we assume farm animals must equal barn. If there's farm animals, they must have been in a barn. That's our assumption. But see, the problem is that assumption is wrong. We can't read this verse from a Western perspective, from what we would have in Western society. In fact, history tells us something a little bit different about how these types of animals were handled in that era of time. There probably wasn't a barn like what we have today, unless you were super wealthy, unless you were the king and you had a lot of horses, or you were some wealthy person. Maybe the Roman military had a large set of stables for their animals, but the average person would not have a barn. You probably wouldn't see one just sitting around town somewhere. This isn't like the middle of the country in Pennsylvania where you have barns, every 500 feet. This would have been a different dynamic in history. And a lot of the research that's been done by this was done by a man named Kenneth Bailey. And so you should look him up. I've got a link to his information, at least one of his books, in my article. So go check that out. You can get a link to his stuff. He's got a lot of really good writing on Middle Eastern culture and collectivist societies, especially from kind of the first century time frame. So one of the things that Bailey's research revealed was that families owned animals. It was very common for a family to have maybe a cow or a sheep or a donkey, maybe one of each, depending on their social status. And in the evening time, when it was time to kind of go in for the night, the animals would be brought into the house with them. Okay, now that's not something we would think of today. We wouldn't think, okay, it's nighttime, let's bring the cow into the living room. But that's the mindset of this culture for a couple of reasons. Number one, it gave the animals some safety and security. You didn't have to worry about your animals being stolen in the middle of the night. Number two, it created a greater degree of body heat inside the home. For during wintertime, you could actually warm the home a lot easier when you had an 800-pound cow and a sheep and a goat or whatever else in your home. Okay, so the way this worked is there was typically a division in the house. Somewhere near the door there would be a half wall or maybe a full wall, and the animals would be brought in the evening, and they'd be placed in this area. This would be kind of the animal enclave, if you will, of the house. And then the rest of the house, in most first century time frame, or maybe a little bit earlier, depending on when we would date the birth of Jesus, the homes were set up where you basically had one large room that was used for everything. That was the kitchen, that was the living room, that was the dining room, that's where everybody slept. And then you had this other little side spot where you had the animals. Okay, now some wealthier families might have even had a second room that was used for guests. Okay, we'll get to that in a few minutes. But for the most part, you're going to have a large room and you're going to have some animals off to the side. And then what would happen is they would place a manger somewhere. Sometimes it might be in the main room, so the cow could kind of lean his head over that partial wall and eat some food. It could be built into that wall so the animals have easy access to it. There were, a couple of different ways that could happen. And so this is how we need to view this story, is that animals weren't necessarily kept in a barn, they were kept in people's houses, which means that a manger would also be in a house. Okay, so that's the first part of the story. The second part we need to look at is the issue of the inn. What did Luke mean when he said inn? Now, we can't assume just because there was a manger that Jesus was born in a barn, but we also can't assume that just because Luke said inn that they couldn't find a hotel. Okay, we also have to look at this from a Middle East kind of first century time frame, right? There weren't Holiday Inns on every corner. There wasn't a Hilton down the street. Now there was certainly some kind of lodging in the city, that would be normal, but not to the scale we would be used to of a 20-story, 30-story building with 40 rooms per floor, nothing like that. And so if we look at this word and we look at it in the Greek, and I don't know if I'll get the pronunciation right here, it's something like katalimati. That word can also be translated as guest room. And actually, if we jump over to Mark 14:14 or Luke 22:11, that's how it's translated there. It's translated as guest room. Now those two accounts of the story when Jesus sent the disciples to go find a place to have the Passover meal and to go ask the owner, like, where's the guest room that's been set aside? So guest room, right? So Luke is translated in this initial verse we have as inn, but later it's translated in another spot of Luke as guest room. So why the translators translate it one way or the other is debatable. But what we do know is that it can be used as guest room, and that's how it's translated in both Mark and in Luke. So if Luke was referring to a guest room instead of an inn, well then that changes the story a little bit, right? Perhaps there was a house with another room that somebody was already staying in a guest room. And when Mary and Joseph showed up to that house to stay the night, the guest room, the inn, was already taken, and so they stayed in the living room with the rest of the family. If this is the case, then we could conclude that Jesus was most likely born not in a barn, but in a living room. Probably born in somebody's living room while the guys hung out outside, Mary gave birth inside, and afterwards laid the baby into a manger, okay, that was probably close by. That fits the historical narrative a little bit better than some pregnant lady was sent out back to give birth in the barn because nobody wanted to give up a room for her. All right, now that brings us to the cultural context piece. Think about a collectivist society. If you haven't listened to my other video content where I talk about collectivist societies, go look at those, or go read some content on ancient collectivist societies. What you may find is that it's unlikely a collectivist society would have sent a pregnant lady outside to give birth in the barn. Okay, we know Joseph was returning to his hometown. We know that there was taxation taking place, which in that culture with the Romans likely meant you were going to a place where you owned property. So Joseph probably owned property in town. Maybe not a house, but property. And since he was going back to a town with his relatives, where his relatives lived, then likely he had relatives who were living in town. Okay? And so it's very likely that Joseph and Mary showed up at maybe a relative's home or a friend's home to stay the night, and that guest room was already taken, and so they stayed in the living room. That would have been normal in that society. So the question is, why didn't Luke just tell us, oh, Joseph and Mary stayed with some friends and she gave birth in the living room while the guys waited outside? Why didn't he just say that? Well, if this is the correct interpretation, Luke would have already known who his intended audience was and what they would have already known. They would have understood how travel arrangements would have worked in that era. So he wouldn't need to give all those details, because there would be an assumption, oh yeah, these guys understand how this works. You stay in the living room or you stay in the guest room. Okay, so he wouldn't need to share that with us. Now, do we know for certain Jesus was born in a house? No, I don't think we can say 100% accurate, but I think we can say that the odds he was born in a barn is very, very small, probably close to 0%. So, thus saith the Lord, Jesus was not born in a barn. He was likely born in someone's house, in someone's living room. Okay, take a minute to look at the article when you have some time. There's a link in there to Bailey's work that I think you'll enjoy. Please leave some comments. I'd love to know what you think about this one. Have you heard this story before? Do you think it's accurate? Also, don't forget to like and to follow, and I'll see you next time.